After the American Civil War, the American government, the national government, the federal government under Lincoln and then under his successor Andrew Johnson, are faced with a real problem. The people of the American South were willing to fight a war to prevent the federal government from freeing their slaves against their will, on the premise that a federal government powerful enough to do that is inherently tyrannical, because a government that can take anything it wants from you without your permission is a government that has the power of a tyranny, and eventually that power will be used. So they fought. Not all Southerners were stupid or evil. Most of them were not slave owners. They were convinced to fight for freedom. Now, that's a rather odd thing to say about a slave society, but this is what they believed. And it's that belief that the American government had to struggle with. At first, radical Republican Congress attempts to have radical reconstruction of Southern society. By laws and legalism from Washington, like lightning bolts, a bunch of laws appear, and suddenly you have black congressmen from Southern states. And you have whites having to deal with all sorts of regulations to try to reconstruct them from being nasty pro-slavery people to being nice Americans. It didn't work. When the American troops were withdrawn from the southern states in the early 1870s, they all returned to a society that was not what we would call racially tolerant. They established a series of Jim Crow laws, and these Jim Crow laws created second-class citizenship for the blacks, and they were again used by Hitler's people in crafting the Nuremberg anti-Semitic laws of 1934-35. In the case of Germany, you have a society that is Western, Christian, civilized by Western standards, but that had for a dozen years, been under the sway of the National Socialist German Workers' Party and its leader. And they had built a police state, a surveillance state where people spied on one another and tested each other's beliefs. Many of the Germans, while not necessarily being convinced Nazis, were not hostile to the Nazi ideal. And many Germans were convinced Nazis. How do you deal with that when you're trying not to build a colony of France, but a free Germany? In Japan, the problem is even deeper. Japan is not a Christian society. It is not a Western society. It is a society that has superficially been more Western than the Westerners since the Meiji Restoration of the late 1800s. But they're, at their heart, Shinto. They're at their heart protectors and servants of the God Emperor. They're at their heart willing to use any form to protect that emperor and to make Japanese society strong enough to do its own thing. And they're willing to go through any form necessary. They are highly adaptable in terms of their means. But the ends upon which Japan and Japanese society are based are very, very, very internal, and they're very, very hard for people on the outside to understand. How do you take a society like that and build a liberal democracy? So after the war, in Germany and Japan, you have American and allied governments in Europe and an American government throughout Japan that is interested in denazifying and in reorienting the societies towards sort of center-left liberal democracy, a bit like America's Democrat Party. One of the ironies of this period is that General Douglas MacArthur, a several-time Republican candidate for the Republican nomination for president, sets up in Japan, as he writes the Japanese Constitution and treats the Japanese emperor with, as a superior to an inferior, and the Japanese emperor goes along with this. MacArthur sets up a center-left democracy, a lot like the New Deal in Japan. MacArthur, at Japanese insistence, includes a pacifism clause which prevents the Japanese from having a military. They are allowed, on the other hand, to have a small defense force. The Japanese Self-Defense Force, aside from fighting Godzilla and Ghidorah, is actually one of the strongest militaries in Asia. Shh. And it needs to be, shh, because of the North Koreans and the Chinese, shh, who do not wish Japan well. In Germany, you have a werewolf organization who are former Nazis who kill Germans who work too closely with the Americans. It isn't until the Marshall Plan aid really hits that the werewolves are defeated. But we still have troops in Japan. We still even have troops in Germany as part of our NATO commitment. It has been, from 1945 to 2020? So that's 75 years since the end of World War II. To build a free society that's your ally out of an enemy country takes generations. It's not something that can be done easily through democracy building. It takes a commitment to be there on the ground and work for generations. But it's also the only thing that kept Western Europe from going communist after World War II. We're now into 1948. The Soviets have seen the United States getting more active in the field against them. The Soviets, of course, complain, oh, the West, it's hemming us in. We're surrounded in the Western area by the democracies and in Asia by Japan under American occupation, South Korea, and the Chinese nationalists. Oh, poor communists, we're surrounded. Where, in fact, what they're doing is expanding into every country around the Soviet orbit and taking over wherever they can. But there is a source of embarrassment for the Soviets. At the end of World War II, the four-power agreement, the treaty, there is no treaty, the agreements between the Russians, the Americans, the British, and the French, I guess that's the four-power agreement, not only divide Germany into a Western zone and an Eastern zone, but divide the capital city of Berlin into Western zones and an Eastern zone. The Western zones are controlled by the British and French, and the British and French the Western zones are controlled by the British and the Americans. And the British and the Americans, for the sake of French ego, give the French a zone in Berlin and give a French a zone in West Germany out of their two areas. The Soviets aren't giving any one part of their zone. They're going to control the eastern part of Germany directly for a while. West Berlin is free. The countryside around it is controlled by communists because Germany was ruled by Berlin, and Berlin is now in the very eastern part of the new Germany. The old Germany used to stretch from here to here. The new Germany now stretches from here to here. Germany is really, really shrunk after World War II. And so the capital of Germany that had been in the east but more central is now very far to the east. And this splitting of Berlin gives American, British, and French authority deep inside of communist areas, and it shows, you have the communist areas that are still largely dilapidated, and you have Western areas that are beginning to rebuild. This is a problem. So what Stalin does is he orders the Berlin blockade beginning in the summer of 1948, June 24th or so. And the Berlin blockade cuts off all land travel and water travel to Berlin. No more trains, no more trucks, no more canals. There are 3 narrow air routes to Berlin. And Stalin and the communists believe that by doing this, Western Berlin will starve and the West will have to leave. It'll be a humiliation for the capitalists, rallying cry for the communists, and it will solve the problem of Western forces deep within the communist zone. President Truman orders an airlift. Now, Goering and the Luftwaffe tried airlifting supplies to Stalingrad back in World War II. The Russians remembered that, and they laughed when they heard an airlift. They didn't think it could be done. American General Tunney ends up setting up a system of air transport where people are leaving, taking off and landing from the 3 Berlin airports every 10 minutes or so. He runs it like a railroad. In the Berlin Airlift, a city of millions is supplied with coal from the air. I'll say that again. A city of millions in the coldest winter on record, 1948, 49, is supplied with coal, which is what the people use to keep warm and to power everything and to cook their food, from the air. Coal is usually shipped on these big giant trains. I'm sure you've seen them. To supply a city of millions with coal from the air, and also all the food and all the medicine and all everything else, was an amazing accomplishment. And it's something, again, that as an American you should be proud of. Because even though we lost pilots, even though planes were downed, because the flying conditions weren't perfect. The Soviets didn't really shoot down our planes, but if we strayed, then we were liable to be shot down, and there were a few planes that were damaged. Berlin is built in a swamp. To take off and land often involved being blind by fog and having to rely on radar, which is not very advanced in the late 1940s. Add to that the fact that Berlin is a city. It's not a big countryside area. And the airports are all surrounded by these tall, wrecked buildings, burned out and bombed out during the war. So you try landing a 4-engine transport. As you approach the runway, you are a yard or so, maybe 2 yards above the broken buildings before you are in the runway. We lost a lot of planes. We lost a number of pilots and crew supplying Berlin. But by the next spring, by May 12th, 49, the Russians realized it didn't work. It's over. What the Berlin Airlift does do is it proves to most Americans who are sitting on the fence that the Russians are, in fact, bleeping dangerous. And as a result of this, the commitment to fight communism inside the country and outside the country is stiffened. And we'll talk about that commitment next time.